Very well, no, it's not. I would like to start by thanking the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Dr. Marcos Orellana, who brought us together for 3 days of discussions and reflections that are concluding now with this last session. Indeed, this parallel event to the 54th session of the Human Rights Council was part of the 3rd edition, is part still of the 3rd edition of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks, organized by the Special Rapporteur in collaboration with the Earth Justice and the Geneva Environment Network. And before I give the floor to the moderator of this session, I would like to mention that in the lead-up to the establishment of a science policy panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution, that will certainly be referred as SPP later in the discussions, which follows the implementation of a resolution that was adopted last year at the UN Environmental Assembly. A series of webinars and events that kicked off in April are building bridges and promote the collaboration and knowledge sharing between and among stakeholders. And these events have also as objective to raise public awareness about the ad hoc open and working group that was established following that resolution, and which is now preparing proposals for the establishment of such a panel. And I'm mentioning this because the Geneva Environment Network is supporting the Secretariat of the Open and Working Group in organizing a series of these events, and the outcomes of the session we are having today will also be linked to this series of events that we are co-organizing. And with that, I would now turn to the moderator of this last session, Yves Lador, the Geneva representative of Earth Justice. Yves, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana, and let me start by thanking you and your team for all the work that has been done in the preparation of all this event, of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks, but also all the work that has been done during this week with all of our events. And we're very happy now to open the last of these events around the presentation by the Special Rapporteur of his report to the current session of the Human Rights Council. Now, in the excellent slide that you just presented before, Diana, we see very well all of the events related to chemical issues which are coming up until the end of this year. But it's important to underline that the SPP, as we will be referring to the shortcut or the short name for this longer name, is a very specific and different one, because here the objective is to develop something that would be the equivalent of the IPCC for the chemical and pollution sector. So it's of a bit of a different nature and of a different type of negotiation. So for that, we will start this discussion by hearing the Special Rapporteur, in particularly on his report, his previous report on the right to science, which, as we had the opportunity to discuss about it in several events before, is a very important and crucial document, not only for the right to science in the field of chemicals and toxics, but with a much larger view. So it is an important document that will probably help to evaluate the outcome of these negotiations. Then we'll have also the privilege to hear Mrs. Tessa Goverse. I hope I'm not pronouncing it wrong. Please correct me if I did. And who is the head of the Secretariat of the SPP. So we really have with us two leading figures in this process. And then we will follow by a number of comments from experts who have a very specific view on how to work on this issue, what can it bring, how to mobilize the scientific community, and I'll be presenting them just afterwards. So to start, I'll turn to the Special Rapporteur, Marcos Orellana. So Marcos, a few years ago, you presented this report, The Right to Science, that was really forward-looking. We can see that now, how much it was forward-looking. And it's a document to which we're now giving more and more references to, not only in the field of toxics, but also in the wider fields of other type of discussions. So I suppose that you're looking very closely to the SPP process, the negotiation. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yves. And Thank you again to the Geneva Environment Network and Earth Justice for co-organizing the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. We're now in our third edition, and this is the last panel. And of course, the best is for the last. Sometimes they say this is such an interesting and important conversation to have. So you're right, Eva. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to present a thematic report to the Human Rights Council on the right to science. How did that come about? It was a good moment to reflect on the right to science, I thought, because the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights had recently published a general comment looking at Article 15 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights of the UN in a comprehensive manner. So there was a good basis to capture that momentum and look at the specific implications of the right to science for toxics, where it has significant impacts. That was one consideration. Another was the distance between the available scientific evidence on risks. Sure, there are many areas of uncertainties and there's many things we don't know, but there's a lot of things we do know. And despite the knowledge that exists, the regulatory measures that have been adopted at the global level and in countries, that distance is creating a gap, and that gap is resulting in a lack of protection to countless individuals whose human rights are compromised. And at the global level, it is resulting in the toxification, in the growing, increasing toxification of our planet. And so I was very pleased that as a result of those discussions that went into the elaboration of that report, member states, perhaps for other reasons, but also for the reasons that I'm articulating, decided to table a proposal at the UN Environment Assembly for the creation of a new science policy panel on chemicals and wastes. It was later also to address pollution. At the time, it wasn't clear that this proposal would pass. At the time, it did not even enjoy the unanimous support from many in civil society that saw lots of risks in having another layer of science assessments and policy relevance, because it could, of the risk that it could be captured by industry. And for those, I try to deal with those issues in my report in highlighting conflicts of interests issues. I speak of mercenary scientists, scientists for hire. I speak about product defense firms whose line of business is to spread confusion, because confusion delays, it diverts attention, it paralyzes, and every day that goes on without adequate change is money in the bank for some that profit on the health of others. This is the crude reality that we're living in, but I see a lot of potential in a science policy panel, and so that's one of the recommendations in the report. I was very pleased to support that at UNEA, and then very pleased to see that UNEA decided to move in this direction. And now, as you said, looking at the process from a distance, but very closely. So in that sense, delighted to be joining this panel and listening to the various speakers that will follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcos. So let's turn now to Mrs. Tessa Goverse, and you're heading the Secretariat of the SPP. I've got to check on the board. When is your next meeting? Because I'm getting confused with the dates, because there's so many things are happening, but you'll tell us exactly what are the next steps and how things are proceeding. The floor is yours, and once again, Tessa, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Yves, and the pleasure is mine. Many thanks to the organizers of this event for inviting me to participate in the Toxic Free Talk on the right to science, which is indeed the last of a series of very interesting talks this week. So I indeed would like to start and congratulate the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, the Geneva Environment Network, and Earth Justice for putting this very interesting series of discussions this week together on the various linkages between the human rights and sound management of chemicals and waste. And of course, with the ICCM5 coming up right now, it couldn't have been more timely. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Tessa Goverse. And since August, I'm heading the Secretariat of the Ad Hoc Open-Ended Working Group on a Science Policy Panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution. So in short, we often speak about the SPP. The right to science is a topic very close to my heart. I started my career over 20 years ago in the United Nations Environment Programme, working on the Global Environment Outlook, and in particular supporting a special edition for, but also by, children and youth. And it was very instructive to see what they decided were the key findings of such a major assessment, and also how they complemented these findings with their own experiences and their own expressions. I've been engaged in many assessments and foresight processes, including on chemicals and waste, and whereas the science is sometimes complex and difficult to grasp, the story of how people or ecosystems are affected by the absence of sound management of chemicals and waste really brings home the issues time and again. And it is the duty of the international community to protect people and the environment. And the right to science is fundamental in that regard, keeping the environment under review and also ensuring the evidence base for decision-making is there, but also in having a voice in who is making the decisions and on what basis. And as was mentioned in the introduction, the fifth session of the UN Environment Assembly decided that a science policy panel should be established to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and prevent pollution. The open-ended working group is mandated by the UN Environment Assembly under this resolution 5/8 to develop proposals for the establishment of the science policy panel. So this open-ended working group has in total 3 sessions to complete its work by 2024. And early this year, we completed the first session in Bangkok in Thailand. The second session will take place in December, the 11th to the 15th, in Jordan, in Dead Sea. And the third and final session is planned for June next year, kindly hosted by the government of Switzerland in Geneva. And while a future panel is still under negotiation, its relationship with key stakeholders is one of the substantive matters to be discussed at the second session of the open-ended working group in December in Jordan. The human rights community is one of the relevant key stakeholders for the future panel. And there's a number of reasons for that. First, I would like to start to point out that the human rights community and the future science policy panel share some common ideas. On the 28th of July, 2022, the UN General Assembly passed this historical resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. The General Assembly called upon states, international organizations, businesses, and other stakeholders to scale up efforts to ensure a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment for all. And in particular, the resolution affirms that its promotion requires the full implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. So in line with this latest recognition and other well-established human rights, such as the right to a life with dignity and the right to the highest attainable standard of health, the first session of the open-ended working group decided on the objective of the panel, which is very much aligned. The objective of the panel is now discussed as being to strengthen the science policy interface, to contribute to the sound management of chemicals and waste, and to prevent pollution for the protection of human health and the environment. And while the text may still be further refined in the next 2 sessions, it's likely that the panel shares the same intentions as the human rights community. Second, the human rights community can provide critical knowledge, data, and perspectives on the work of the open-ended working group and the future panel once it is established. And again, I would like to congratulate the Special Rapporteur on his good work on the right to science. It's a very interesting read, and the 2021 report provides many critical aspects that the open-ended working group may wish to take into consideration. And for example, conflict of interest, policies and procedures will be one of the topics discussed at the second session in Jordan later this year. And in this regard, I also would like to take the opportunity to highlight that the Secretariat is currently preparing a webinar on conflict of interest as well to learn from existing interfaces and other good practices. And I, of course, would like to welcome all of you to participate. Later on, once the panel is established, it will need to determine and execute its work program. And a human rights perspective might be one of the important considerations for defining priorities so that the panel would deliver products that take into account the needs of those who are impacted by chemicals, waste, and pollution. And third, the human rights community can contribute to fostering the policy uptake of the panel's work to help bring the science produced or brought to the table to those who need to take decisions or those who may be affected or risk to be impacted. At its first session, the open-ended working group decided on 5 functions for the panel. First, undertaking horizon scanning to identify issues of relevance to policymakers. Second, conducting assessments. Third, providing up-to-date information, encouraging and supporting communications and raising public awareness. Fourth, facilitating information sharing with countries. And fifth, capacity building. The human rights community can contribute to the dissemination of the panel's work at various levels, in various communities, and also in languages beyond the 6 UN languages. It can contribute to raising awareness and strengthening the capacity of policymakers and the public to foster the uptake of the panel's work into effective action. And therefore, the shared common goals with much knowledge, data, and perspective to learn and benefit from, and with possible joint efforts to extend the panel's work from the meeting rooms to create a real-life impact, I'm convinced that the future panel will have many interesting and fruitful opportunities for interaction with the human rights community. And I once more would like to thank the organizers, and I would like to invite you all to follow the open-ended working group process and provide inputs to the stages now, as well as when the future panel is established. Working together, we can all work towards a pollution-free planet with a clean and healthy environment while leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tessa. Very, very clear. So now let's turn to some of the different reactions or contributions that could be done in this process. And of course, a number of institutions are directly concerned in the field of human rights and in the field of environment. So we'll start now with at least with the environmental part by turning to Mr. Augustin Harte. Augustin, you're program officer and scientific advisor at the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat. For those who are not familiar, that's a pretty long name, but there's a reason for that, because it's a secretariat which is managing the 3 conventions, 3 very crucial conventions on toxics, so on waste, on PIC, prior informed consent, and on POP, the pollutant, the persistent organic pollutant. 3 related and an important convention which are being managed together. So, Augustin, how do you see the contribution that the 3 conventions can bring in this process? The floor is yours, and once again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you again for the invitation, to all the organizers, and giving me the opportunity to represent the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat in this very interesting side event. Can you see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So to start my short intervention, I would like to also give an example, as Tessa said, close to my heart, of what I understand of the science policy interface when talking about environmental issues. This is moving. Yeah. So this is my brother in my hometown, San Isidro, in the province of Buenos Aires, Argentina. And there we enjoy of a very nice coastline of the Rio de la Plata, which is one of the widest rivers in the earth. And recently, a couple of years ago, this is a picture of myself with my students from the public university taking water samples to measure water quality. And I give this example because the municipalities all over the coastline of the Rio de la Plata have joined forces with the provincial government, with the national government, and with universities and scientific institutions to monitor every quarter periodically the water quality of the river. And what is that for? The measures that are taken, then they are used for policymakers at the different levels to take decisions. At the municipality level, for example, to provide information on the water quality and to whether approve or not activities such as water sports. At the provincial level, on recommendations of fishing. Actually, it's been a few years from now that commercial fishing in this area is prohibited because of the high level of different pollutants, including pesticides, including POPs and heavy metals such as mercury. So this is a virtuous network and a good example of how science can inform policymakers to take decisions to protect the population. But going back to business, as mentioned in my introduction, I'm here representing the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions. It will take me a lot of time to explain each of the conventions, but I will try to do that in 1 minute. So for the Stockholm Convention, this convention addresses some of the most relevant pollutants on Earth because of their nature. They bioaccumulate through the food webs. They affect and have adverse effects on impacts on human health and the environment, and they persist. They are so-called the forever chemicals. They stay for a long time. Within the convention, parties to the convention agree on prohibiting and restricting the production and use of these chemicals. Then we have the Rotterdam Convention, which establishes a procedure for the prior informed consent for controlling the exports and imports of a list of hazardous substances, including pesticides and industrial chemicals, which have been banned or restricted in different areas around the world. And finally, the Basel Convention, which deals with hazardous waste and other types of waste, and recently new amendments on plastic waste and on e-waste, electronic equipment waste, which establishes a mechanism where exporter countries have to notify and transit and importer countries have to approve the movement and the import of these types of waste, ensuring that the destination is on an environmentally sound manner way. And the Basel Convention also provides extensive guidance on the best environmental practices and technologies for waste disposal, including recovery operations such as recycling and final disposal operations such as incineration or landfills. And as I said before, all these conventions heavily rely on science and technical knowledge. Science was needed even when these conventions were conceived. Negotiations for the drafting of the provisions of the conventions required technical knowledge on chemicals and waste. More recently, for deciding of the listing, for example, of new chemicals under the Stockholm Convention and the Rotterdam Convention, we have specialized scientific bodies, the so-called Chemical Review Committee, the CRC, and the POPs Review Committee, the POPROC, very fancy names, that will actually meet in a couple of weeks in Rome, as usual, to decide on the proposals and recommend to the parties to list new chemicals in the annexes of the respective conventions. So this is also a great example on how science is required to make decisions and move forward on the agendas of these relevant conventions. Another important aspect that when science is needed under all the multilateral environmental agreements is to assess whether the actions and provisions of these conventions are effective or not. And I will give here an example of the Stockholm Convention, the Global Monitoring Plan, which is established under the effectiveness evaluation process of the convention, which actually relies on scientists from all around the world to sample and analyze environmental matrices such as human milk, the air, water, biota, and others to determine the levels and trends of the pollutants in the environment. Because actually, this is the most important question of the Stockholm Convention. Are we reducing the emissions and releases of these POPs to the environment to protect human health? And so scientists are invited, they collaborate, they generate regional networks, and then they develop this global assessment, which the third report is available on the link. I've left every link so you can access the information. And it's an essential part of the process to assess the effectiveness of this convention. One extra thing that the VRS conventions have engaged as requested by the parties is this roadmap from science to action. Since 2017, parties recognized at the Conference of the Parties that enhancing science collaboration with policymakers was needed. And there was an adoption of a decision that established a roadmap, which actually established several action points requested for the Secretariat to support on enhancing collaboration, cooperation, and communication and information exchange with science makers, policymakers, and other relevant stakeholders. These are the pictures of last workshops in different regions where we are inviting not only policy makers and scientists, but also other stakeholders such as the industry, when usually information to take action is produced. And finally, on international cooperation, you may know that we have our last conference of the parties a couple of months ago, in late May. One of the key points that the parties requested the Secretariat is to strengthen the cooperation at the international level with relevant international bodies. And one of those was, of course, the open-ended working group that is establishing, and Tessa will explain, negotiating to the establishment of a science to policy panel at the international level. So the parties to the VRS conventions requested the Secretariat to cooperate in close relation with them and to provide the experience and expertise that we have while implementing these conventions to further enhance and support the negotiations. As a final point, I would like to say that in the first meeting of that open-ended working group, I recall that several regions highlighted the need to include an objective on training and capacity building, as Tessa explained. The experience of the VRS Convention Secretariat was highlighted by delegates as a good example to support developing countries, and we will be happy to share that experience with everyone. Another key aspect that is important to our conventions and somehow is lacking is the prevention aspect. The VRS conventions rely on information of existing impacts to human health and the environment. A future panel could consider tools such as horizon scanning to identify global boundaries and emerging issues on the aspects of pollution and recommend possible actions to prevent future damage. We need to shift from reaction to prevention. Finally, parties to the conventions have highlighted the need to better integrate actions to tackle the triple planetary crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. A new panel focusing on chemicals, waste, and pollution prevention could interact and collaborate with the existing scientific international panels such as the IPCC and IPBES, which are well established, and they are already collaborating with each other, but also with other scientific bodies and technical groups within the multilateral environment agreements. So this is an open invitation for, when negotiating the establishment of a new panel, consider the possibilities to engage and collaborate with others and to develop further and better recommendations for policymakers to take action. And with this, I would like to thank back all of you for the invitation. And again, I would also like to thank the rapporteur for a very interesting report on the right to science. I also recommend that lecture. It highlights a lot of interesting points that should be addressed by all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augustine. And I'd like also to say that I really appreciate that you're doing this intervention in the middle of your own trip on your way to Bonn. So it's very nice of you of taking the time to stop and share this with us. So now, after the environmental sector, which was so brilliantly presented, we'll turn to the human rights sector. The opening of the current session of the Human Rights Council, where the report of the Special Rapporteur were presented, there was a very noticed statement by the High Commissioner on the status of the world. Of course, it was a bit more focused on the climate change issues, but which is one of the challenges we have, is that we are facing a triple planetary crisis, and you cannot switch from one crisis to the other. We have to solve all of them together. But still, the High Commissioner has been very clear on environmental issues, including on the struggle against toxics and waste. And so it clearly showed that there is a contribution that can be given. And I think what was said right at the beginning by Tessa shows clearly that the human rights community has a role to play in this. So how are you seeing this on your side at the Office of the High Commissioner? So Igor, the floor is yours. And just for me to say that you're a member of the Environment and Climate team of the Office of the High Commissioner, an extremely active team. One of their members is already now in Bonn for the ICCM5. You are definitely where things are happening, which is really great. So how do you see all of this? Igor, the floor is yours, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Yves. Thank you, colleagues. It's really the honor for me to be here on behalf of the Environment and Climate Change team of OSCHR. Indeed, Anna Paula was actually initially to come here, but because of her trip to Bonn, I have this honor. So, as my colleague Tessa already highlighted, all people everywhere have a right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which was recently recognized by the Human Rights Council, but also by the General Assembly resolutions. That resolution in General Assembly was adopted with a strong support, sending a powerful message that there is a widespread worldwide support for this right, which is already recognized in over 150 countries, member states around the world, and also on regional level. Clean air, a safe climate, access to safe water and adequate sanitation, healthy and sustainable produced food, non-toxic environment in which we all have to live, work, study, and play, and healthy biodiversity and ecosystems are generally recognized as the key elements of that right. A human rights-based approach to addressing the triple planetary crisis calls for a vision that aligns with scientific evidence, centers on principles of accountability and informed participation, and gives special attention to the needs of people in vulnerable situations. The United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights stipulates that industry and governments must make all efforts to promote accurate scientific information. This means no more disinformation and no more deliberate misinforming of the public to erode understanding and respect to science and scientific research. The right to science requires that policies be based on the best available scientific evidence. but in reality, there is a gap between scientific knowledge and regulatory response. This gap is a result of disinformation, lack of participation of civil society, and design of environmental policies, and the undermining of the science policy interface by conflict of interest. As a precondition, there should be an enabling environment for the conduct of scientific inquiry free from undue interference. However, for decades, many industrial companies have deliberately manipulated and challenged assessments of the environmental safety of chemicals and industrial regulatory decisions. Historical examples of this include the tobacco industry, sugar, soft drinks industry, fossil fuel and atomic energy industry, medical and chemical industry, among others. We see every day more and more instances when corporate influence on regulatory processes and the creation of doubt, artificial manufactured doubt. For example, actions that deliberately alter scientific facts and empirical findings to the benefit of industry, a particular company, or a group of individuals. Right, such as directly attacking a study design and listing the support of the respected scientists and others. Conflict of interest declaration alone is not enough. These experts with commercial ties must be prevented from having undue proximity to regulatory bodies and definitely excluded from the committees with decision-making power regarding the environmental risk assessment. Here, I want to dedicate a few words to the concept of the human rights economy, which aims to center people and their risk, including the right to a healthy environment and the right to science in economic policy making, business models, investment decisions, and consumer choices. It embraces the transformative potential of human rights principles if they were actually applied and respected as a part of the rule of law. A human rights economy recognizes that the right to science is integral to fostering innovation, improving living standards, and addressing global challenges such as healthcare, education, social and environmental sustainability. By ensuring that scientific advancements are harnessed for the benefit of all and not just a privileged few, societies can create a more equitable and inclusive economic frameworks that uphold the dignity and rights of every individual. We, as the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, believe that science and human rights must direct our actions. We have too often seen what happens when profit wins over the human health, rights, and dignity. Big polluters can and must be held to account. Scientists have provided powerful tools for us to achieve this. In celebration of 25th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this year, OECHR is forcibly advocating for actions that will reimagine the economic structures which have driven so much destruction of our environment. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Igor, for this presentation, and it's interesting to hear about the human rights economy, which definitely is something that should be driving our decisions, and probably needs quite more recognition than it's the case at the moment. So now we'll turn to our third sector, the science sector, with Mrs. Greta Goldenman. Greta, you are the coordinator of the Global PFAS Science Panel, PFAS being the terrible toxics which we find a bit everywhere. And you were previously the former chair of the Green Science Policy Institute. So in your practice, although you're a lawyer by training, you've been working very closely with the scientific community. And so you have a particular experience of how scientists deal with these issues. How do they get involved? How do they get involved while keeping their integrity as scientists? On the basis of all of your experience, what would you like to share with us in this discussion in view of the SPP negotiation? Thanks for being with us, Greta, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves, for this introduction. Yes, I have been involved in this interface between science and policy for a number of years in this area of toxics and waste. And what I'd like to talk about is the policy side of things, the view of policymakers and their need for science along the way. I think a lot of scientists think that in order to be unbiased, they cannot get involved with policy. And I think that's a grave mistake that we have to really overcome there. There is a responsibility of scientists in these discussions. So science is not only a right, I think it's a responsibility. And when a scientist is carrying out work that has policy implications, I think it's important for them to be able to reach out and to become involved in some of these policy processes. And for that, I think there has to be a lot of dialogue between science and policymakers. And that's also something that policymakers struggle with, I've found, how to formulate a request to a scientist concerning the information that they might need to move forward with a policy. So I have a couple of experiences to do the Green Science Policy Institute. We have a lot of experience. I see.
Greta,
Yes.
can you hear me? Sorry, we're having slight problems in terms of sounds. It's small stopping sometimes. So the last sentences you pronounced were unheardable not comprehensible for us. Understandable. Sorry. Perhaps would you like to repeat and perhaps slower? So we hope that we can overcome this small technical difficulties. Apologies for having interrupted you.
I will go slower. I wanted to pull up a couple of examples of how collaborating with scientists for policy changes can be very successful. At the Global PFAS Science Panel, which is a collaboration between academic scientists, regulatory scientists, and policy analysts such as myself, we've come together to try to figure out how we can really bring about some very concrete changes to try to move towards reducing the exposure to PFAS in the world. And we started that out with an article, a scientific article in 2019, proposing the concept of essential use, which was taken from the Montreal Protocol. And that has been taken up now by EU policymakers who are now debating whether that can be a very important part of the overall European Union's chemicals policy. Another example of that is the work that we've been doing on trying to make the scientific case for why the whole group of PFAS, which today is over 14,000 that are considered to be on the commercial market, why these chemicals have a number of characteristics in common, including their extreme persistence. That means that so that they need to be regulated as a group rather than individually. That's quite a struggle. It continues to go on. The chemicals industry is trying to extract fluoropolymers and saying that they're different, but it's important to stay firm because policymakers cannot handle these chemicals chemical by chemical. It takes too much time. We need to start addressing toxics in terms of groups of scientists and be able to figure them, to be able to handle them in a more efficient way in order to be health protective. So I think it's important to reach out to scientists to try to inform them about international policy processes, to try to help them form collaborations so that they can support each other when needed in some of these processes, to learn communication skills, including how to deal with the press, and to be advocates when needed. So thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion.
Thank you very much, Greta. These were really very useful examples, and apologies to have to interrupt you, but it was really worth for you to talk a bit slower, so we were able to go through these small technical issues. and to hear the examples you were giving. It is true that if we take the IPCC is supposed to produce scientific information which is policy relevant. But probably there's an effort now to do also to make sure that those who are doing the policies do also policy which is scientifically relevant. And that's probably the other part which has not been developed correctly. And probably here there is clearly a role for the human rights. These type of dialogues that you were saying between the policymakers and the different type of academic scientists and regulator scientists, and that's also a very interesting element, because also they play, for example, within the IPCC, they play different roles. Regulators come only at the second stage, regulator scientists, and it's a stage between the purely the academic scientific discussions, and then afterwards the policymakers. So there's a really interesting development. Probably we hope to be seen to be taken on board by the SPP. And I don't know if that will be in the negotiation process or at a later stage. That could be an interesting element, perhaps, to have the views of our panelists on. So perhaps I'd like to turn now directly for a first comment to the Special Rapporteur. Marcus, after hearing these different views and on the challenges, do you have a very first comment before we perhaps also then give the floor to the panelists again?
Thank you very much, Yves, and thank you to all the panelists for quite insightful presentations. Perhaps I could mirror a couple of things and highlight and echo, for example, as Tessa was mentioning about who's deciding, because we may have evidence, but then if that evidence doesn't reach the right people, then who's deciding? I think that's a very, very interesting and important question for us to grapple with. Agustin, you talked about going from reaction to prevention. No doubt a key issue. Unpacking that, there's a lot that can come out of it, and so I thought I'd pick on that. And Igor, you spoke about the 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and how that is an opportunity to again realign and put human rights at the center, because the declaration, it doesn't talk about the environment, and that's not because people didn't breathe clean air at the time. It wasn't an issue. There wasn't an obstacle. There wasn't opposition. It just didn't come up. But it comes up now because the stakes couldn't be higher with the triple planetary crisis. So there's a real opportunity. And Greta, chemicals as a group and PFAS as a group is something that I've also incorporated in some reports that I've put out. The issue of essential uses, I was in a program recently where in the context of EU legislation, some people were trying to identify, well, what would be some of the essential uses? And then the list became so long that the exception began to swallow the rule. So there's some risk there, and there's also then space for unpacking. I thought those would be some preliminary reactions very quickly, telegraphic even, before furthering the conversation. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. What I'll do now is to go back to the different panelists to have their feedbacks from what they heard from their colleagues in the panel, and also if ever you have a final question or final remark to the special rapporteur on which we will conclude. So I'll go back to the list, and I'll come back to you, Tessa, to know if there was some elements you'd like to highlight or you want to underline, or you think that should be particularly important to have in mind in view of the coming negotiation. Perhaps one other thing I'd like also to say, so that everybody has this clearly in mind, because we saw with the Basel Convention, the BRS, sorry, not just Basel, but the whole of the three conventions, that there are already a number of scientific bodies who are operating right now and directly feeding into the definition process and the identification of a number of substances that need perhaps to be banned or regulated. The SPP is aiming at something different. So if we have the IPCC as a model, and in a way we're walking away from purely expertise to something which I think is well described by this idea of science policy interface. So I was wondering if on this basis you had any elements you want to add and perhaps to do any call to the human rights community. The floor is yours, Tessa.
Thank you very much, Yves, and thank you to all actually for very interesting examples and reflections as well. I would start to say that obviously the science policy panel is there to really build on some of the learning and the experiences that are there. I think we see a progressive improvement of the science policy interface. And one of the things that member states have also asked us specifically is actually look at these examples. And indeed, that also includes looking at what is happening in, for example, the BRS conventions, and very much also taking into account what's already existing and what is working. But I think there is a need out there from the policymakers as well that go beyond perhaps the areas where there is currently already an emphasis and a focus in terms of the types of chemicals, for example, to focus on. Having said that, obviously there's also many questions and asks that could come from the panel from various stakeholders, including those that are also the ones that we may benefit from in terms of the learning right now. So there's that from the chemical side, but also from the science policy interface side, as was already pointed out, the IPCC, the IPBES. We can learn from how these panels and platforms have been established, what works, what doesn't work. And also, I think the reflections already given in the room are extremely helpful. And I think that would really be an additional benefit. It also is ultimately about indeed addressing the triple planetary crisis in an interactive manner. And I think that fully comes back to the right to a clean and healthy environment. So this would be my first reflection. I think what is critical is that we see how the gap can be narrowed between science and policy. And in that sense, I think it's very important to understand the needs of policymakers. And I thought we got some great examples that a chemical by chemical approach is perhaps not something that will be manageable. And also, I think it is about looking more at the prevention side of things, as we also currently are faced with certain situations that perhaps we should try to avoid. Thank you so much. I'll leave it with this for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa. So I'll turn now to Augustin. Augustin, for the BRS conventions and your secretariat, do you think that perhaps precisely the SPP can lead us to more work on groups of substances or sectoral approach? And would that change part of the work which is done right now under the three conventions?
Yes, thank you, and very interesting speeches we heard from the panel. Regarding the grouping issue, we discussed from the BRS, and we have learned throughout the years on how to address groups of chemicals. As you may know, for the fluorinated chemicals, we are now discussing the inclusion of another group of the PFAS family into the Stockholm Convention. And it's quite a challenge because when developing the list of specific substances that are covered in these groupings, we find hundreds and even thousands of different chemicals that might be produced and used in many different applications. So the challenge of grouping chemicals is not an easy task. It requires a lot of technical insight, but also it has proven effective when taking measures at the policy level, for regulating those chemicals. So this is an approach that is taking more and more under the Stockholm Convention, and I think it's here to stay. Another big issue when considering new chemicals is, and we have learned from the past as well, is the issue on regrettable substitutions. And I can give you an example. We prohibited and listed and prohibited under the Stockholm Convention the brominated flame retardants, only to find out that the substitutions that were proposed, the fluorinated ones, had the same effects on the environment and health and brought the same problems. So regrettable substitution is another issue that we are working closely, and for new chemicals to be listed, is an aspect that is really being considered. Finally, I also wanted to raise another point that also came into the discussions regarding I already mentioned that the aspect on prevention. And this also comes to an opportunity for the new panel, because the chemicals to be considered under the convention, they are proposed by countries. So a country proposes the listing of a new chemical, and then there's a long process of an assessment where the scientific bodies come in and provide risk assessment, risk management evaluation, and finally a recommendation for listing that chemical. The SPP has the opportunity to do a more wider scanning of hazardous substances and pollutants on a wider scope, and then provide with further information and recommendations for countries to trigger, for parties to trigger the new obligations or new provisions under specific multilateral environmental agreements. So we, from the BRS Secretariat, we see an opportunity to widen the scope of this scanning, of this assessment, and then when information is available, then parties may step in and request specific actions under our conventions. So this is one of, not only for chemicals, but also for waste. This is one aspect that it would be very interesting to explore and coordinate how these two different worlds can communicate and collaborate as well.
Augustine, really very, very interesting. Thank you very much for that. Let me turn now to Igor for the human rights sector. Igor, you very rightly said, and that was underlined by the Special Rapporteur, that the 75 years is bringing quite a unique opportunity to look at these issues. Your team is working right now in organizing a number of events that will happen during the November Hotspots month in your program, the program of the Office of the High Commissioner. Do you think that these elements could be taken up in your discussion, particularly the last one, the prevention? Because actually your discussions are going to happen, if I'm correct, before the next meeting of the open-ended working group. So here there could be perhaps some input. What is your take on that?
Yeah, thank you. If I will try to be brief. Actually, this was my initial idea to stop on this particular message shared by Augustine, that we have to move from action to prevention. And yes, the Human Rights 75 initiative is something which we can and we will do with regards to prevention. We indeed foresee several events, and the closest one, which is actually in October, the 20th of October, we'll have the regional dialogue in Brussels on the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment to address these issues exactly in the region of Europe and Central Asia. We do know about the discussions in the Council of Europe about the ongoing instruments which to recognize the right to healthy, clean, healthy, sustainable environment. But it also brings me to the third component, which is accountability. That, yeah, we can prevent, but we can try to prevent. However, we also have to recognize that the human rights harm has been done, and the victims, they do have to have access to accountability mechanisms. So those accountability mechanisms have to be defined. So we talk about 150 countries which recognize their right to the clean, healthy and sustainable environment. But not all of those countries, not all of those regions recognize the accountability mechanism for the human rights harm to that particular right. However, we do know, all of us, that when we talk about toxic, when we talk about the environmental issues, they affect not only this right, they affect all other human rights, economic, social, political, and culture. So we do believe that the mechanism can be found to reach the accountability through the actually new tools and instruments, but also through existing instruments to address this issue. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Igor. That gives us some work to do. Excellent proposals to work on these accountability mechanisms. And probably one of the work we have to do in the human rights community is to make sure that the way we develop these accountability mechanisms fits with the way some accountability mechanisms will also be developed in the coming months and years in the field of toxics and chemical. Thank you very much for that. Now turn to you now, Greta. You said rightly so at the beginning some of the difficulties that scientists feel in order to be sure that they keep their scientific integrity and sometimes have difficulties to step into the policy debate. Well, wouldn't that discussion around the SPP and precisely these definition, and I'm thinking about the coming seminar, which has been announced by the SPP Secretariat on the conflict of interest, isn't this the opportunity for the scientific community to get more involved? This is at the heart of their concern, isn't it, Greta?
It certainly is a very major concern, but I think there's an even bigger concern for that, where the committee, the panel, the SPPC can be involved in, and that is something that Augustine mentioned, which is that there is this scope to take a broader view of the problem of chemicals and waste, and there's an opportunity by taking a broader view of the problem to figure out perhaps how to roll back the toxification of the planet. I think we need to start having very hard discussions about, is it possible to phase out some of these particularly persistent and toxic chemicals? Is it possible to start scaling back the number and the amounts of chemicals that are being used? How can we develop alternatives that might be simpler and that might be less harmful? I would really hope that we can start having some of those very hard discussions that look at some broader questions about the role of these chemicals in our lives and how we can truly try to figure out how to go beyond and start, like I said, detoxification. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this very clear and very, very strong statement. So now, Marcus, as you're probably expecting it, I'm going to turn to you for the very final conclusion. But I'll ask you something to add something on it, which is the fact it's also the last discussion we're having in the framework of this Geneva Toxic Free Talks. What is your take of this 2023 edition of the Toxic Free Talks? And once again, Marcus, thank you so much for your work, for your report, and also for your involvement in the preparation of this Geneva Toxic Free Talks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yves, for your kind words, and thanks to all the panelists that have shared their expertise, also their insights to seeing how the right to science can work in practice. So right to science in action. One of the features of and this is nothing new, of course, of the chemicals and waste landscape is its fragmentation. I've been in meetings where policymakers from governments say, well, we're used to dealing with climate change, IPCC, one treaty, one science body. But here we have this multiplicity of bodies, and that the interaction raises one challenge. But as you mentioned, Yves, also it was mentioned by Tessa, there is a very clear opportunity to learn from the good practices that have informed the field in the design of the SPP, the new science policy panel under elaboration. It is also, I think, an opportunity to learn from what are not good practices, and we can't put a blindfold and not see, for example, how the Rotterdam Convention has had a breakdown in its science policy interface. And this goes back to the point I was echoing earlier on who's deciding and on what basis, and how then does the science engage the policy. But of course, as we know, science can be and is a contested space. This situation in Fukushima is a clear example of that, where the International Atomic Energy Agency is pronouncing that the discharge of waters from Fukushima does not pose a threat or risk because the levels of contamination are below standards defined, whereas there are other scientists arguing that the standards so defined, they don't take into account several things that should have been taken into account, and thus they are inadequate. And if we wait until we see harm, well, then it's too late. And this has, of course, come once and again. Montreal Protocol is perhaps an excellent example of that. Agustin spoke about regrettable substitution. We see that as well. And so there's opportunities to learn from not good practices, let's put it that way. There's a lot to learn. This is a very good moment. I want to also echo, Tessa, your point about conflicts of interest coming up in the next session of the open-ended working group. This is, of course, a very important discussion. I'm very much looking forward to the webinar logistical details when that is announced. All of this is to say that the work of the SPP, given the contested science and given that it's not monolithic, it will no doubt help to broaden human knowledge on the various issues that concern science in regards to chemicals and wastes and pollution. So that will reduce uncertainties, and it will enhance the basis upon which action can be taken. Action can also include litigation, and that's something that perhaps we may want to explore in the fourth edition at the due time of the Geneva Toxic-Free Talks. Perhaps that is a bridge to sharing a couple of reflections on your last question, Yves. The Geneva Toxic-Free Talks, they have given us a space for convening voices, expert voices, voices coming from the field, various stakeholders that sometimes don't have a presence in the policymaking arenas or discussions that address these issues. They have given us an opportunity to deepen knowledge and get into issues in further detail. By way of example, the interactive dialogue, I'm given 10 minutes to present a 10,000 words report. Of course, time is always short, but having the opportunity to have these dialogues and exchange deepens knowledge. It clarifies issues of terminology, conceptual issues. There's a range of issues that need clarification. We anticipate challenges, and in that sense, the talks help us look at the horizon and be ahead of the curve and identify opportunities. And in that sense, it's that commonality or the building common ground that helps us move towards what I think is in everyone's heart, the right to a healthy environment and the right to a toxic-free environment. So in that regard, I couldn't be more grateful to you, Yves, for all the hard work that has gone into putting the program together, to Diana and her team that you can't see over there because of the camera, but you've made this possible. Without the communications and the engagement, it wouldn't have been even possible. Perhaps at some point we send out a survey to all who have participated, and maybe we can also then get some feedback as to what have been the highlights or how can we improve. And similarly, in terms of scanning of what comes next, what are the issues that we address next, there's a lot that we can engage there. But all of that is to say that I am incredibly grateful, incredibly pleased, and very much looking forward to next year's fourth edition of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Well, these will be the excellent concluding words of this session and, of course, of the 2023 Geneva Toxic Free Talks. So, once again, a very warm thanks to all of the panelists. A warm thanks also to all of you who have been attending these meetings, who are right now in the room or who are online. And also to the different organizations. I'm thinking about FIAN International, who organized one of the events. It was great to be able to do this together. We look forward to opening with other organizations also to have these type of exchanges. So I think we're finishing this edition with an interesting list of homeworks, and that was the purpose of this discussions and these talks. So I do think that we've met at least part of some of the objective we had set at the very beginning. And of course, as you said yourself, I cannot end without a great thanks to the Geneva Environmental Network. Without them, without the whole team, which is very well led by Diana, nothing of this would have been possible. So we have to underline this. The Geneva Environmental Network is a central organization, not only just for the work that we are doing, but for the whole of the work which is happening here in Geneva in the field of environment. It's fragmented, it goes in different directions. Well, the meeting place for the environment in Geneva is done by the Geneva Environmental Network, and it is never enough underlined. So once again, Diana, and to your whole team, a huge thanks, and it's just great to be able to work with you and prepare this program. This will be the final words. Thank you very much to everybody. We wish you a good end of the day, and we look forward to meeting again in 1 year at the Geneva Toxic Free Talks 2024.
Thank you.